In our previous video, we looked at the data flow of variables in and out of subroutines, so functions or procedures. And I gave you two ways of doing that, using the structure chart method, which you can see here, or using the table method, which you can see here. They've both got the same information. It's just sometimes a lot easier to make a table than it is to make a structure chart. But some people like it the other way around. But the next step after this is to actually break down what's happening inside these steps into pseudocode. And that's what we're going to do here. So let's have a quick look at some of what will become the pseudocode sections for each of these. So firstly, we're going to look at ask the user to log in. We're passing back username. So when we're starting a pseudocode, it's always a good idea to remind yourself that you've got to return data and just put that in as the first step in your pseudocode, especially if you're using something like a digital document, because then you can always add further steps above. You can see that I typed in return username and then I just added a space above it, and it'll just number it as we go down. For validate password, we're taking in username, but we're returning student list. So we're taking in username, which we haven't mentioned yet, but we're returning student list. So I've passed that. I've written that into the pseudocode. For the third step, we're showing the students list where we're taking it in student list, but we're returning two values, selected student and points. Okay, so again, we're just saying return selected student, comma, points, and that just shows that we're doing that. We're passing data back out. And then the last one is update house points totals. We're taking in selected student and points, which we're not going to mention yet, and we're returning student points. And so we return student points. So that's the first step I would always do when I'm writing my pseudocode. The next step is to try and describe what's happening in each of the steps. So let's look at asking the user to log in. So we could ask the user to enter their username. And if that's all you want to do, if you don't want to validate it in any way, then we can just simply return the username. And that's our pseudocode, those two steps that have to happen. But let's imagine we're going to have to validate it a little bit more. So here's a slightly altered version of the pseudocode where we've got a little bit of validation, and we're just repeatedly asking the user to enter their username until it's not null or blank. Okay, so that's a sort of more extended pseudocode where we're just repeatedly asking them to enter the username until it's not null, but we can go further. And so in this slightly more extended version of asking the user to log in, if the user does enter null, then it displays an error message, and then it will go back to the top and it'll ask the user to enter their username again. And if they enter null again or blank, it'll display an error message, and it'll continue to do that until the username is anything apart from blank. And then it'll return the username. So hopefully you can see that by doing that, I just gradually built up the functionality inside the program. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect at this point, but a starting point is all you need in IP2 to allow you to, this is an imaginary, but imagine you had to pass off your IP2 document to another student in the class and they had to build it. Do they have enough information in the pseudocode to be able to make the function ask the user to log in and return a valid username? Hopefully. But let's look at some of the other pseudocode, and these are just examples just to give you something to refer to. So here's a much more complex example for validate password. So the first thing you should be asking the user to do when they type in their username is their password. So we should ask the user for their password. And then what we're doing from lines 2 to 10 is we're actually running something called a linear search. And we're doing this linear search looking through all of the entries in a usernames array that we've never talked about before, because remember this is a cut down version. But let's just pretend that it exists inside this subroutine only. So it's checking each element of the usernames array to see if it matches the username that's been passed in to the program. And if it does match, it's also checking to see if the password typed in by the user matches the related password for that username. And if it's true, then it says login successful. And then step 6 is very sneaky. It sets the variable or the list that we're going to return by calling another function that we're not going to talk about today. And so we're setting student list to the results of a function called get student list, and we're passing it a username. Okay, and so that will do something fancy with files and things like that, but we don't care. If the usernames and passwords do not match, then it will say validation error. Now, this is a little bit tricky because this will actually just display validation error for anything, anytime it doesn't match the username and password selection. So you'll probably see validation error coming up 100 times if there's 100 users, sorry, 99 times if there's 100 users. And one of them will be correct. But it's okay because it's just to give you an exemplar to work with. And then we have to, if we start an if on line 4, we've got to end the if on line 9. And if we start the loop on line 3, we have to end the loop on line 10. And then once all the loops in the if statements are finished, we should have a student list and we can return it. There's a little bit of error handling required in here, but we're not going to go into it, where student list will only exist because it's created at step 6 if they've managed to log in successfully. But I hope you get the message or the intention behind this particular example. In this example here, showing the students list, we start off by displaying all of the students in the student list. And I'm just showing you that I'm using the index as a kind of identifier there. So it's displaying 0 and then the current student's name, then 1, then the current student's name, and so on and so on. And then it's going to repeatedly ask the user to enter their student ID number. So that's either 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever number it is, matches up to index. And we're going to loop until the student ID is greater than or equal to 0 and also less than or equal to the length of student list. So that kind of means that your student list can be flexible. Once we've got a valid student ID, we're going to ask the user to enter the number of points to award them. And then we've got to return the selected student and points. Now we don't have selected student, so the last step we've got to do is set selected student to the student list array, but use the student ID, which is the index position of that student. And then we return selected student and points. Okay, one more to go. So this exemplar is actually to show you an error, okay? And this is why we do data flow and pseudocode together, because as you're expanding your program, you're probably going to want to go back and work on your data flow a little bit more. So in this instance here, we wanted to update our house points totals. Now you'll remember from the last piece of pseudocode, we've set in step 8 the selected student to the actual identifier. So that could be like Bob. So the selected student is Bob, rather than the number that identifies Bob. And so we return Bob, and let's say there's 50 points back to the main program. Comes back to the main program, we then update the house point totals for Bob and 50 points. And the idea is that we're going to be returned a list of all the students' points. So every single student in that particular class or relates to that particular username with their new points total. But there's a bit of an issue here. If we start off by getting the student points, that's quite handy. There's an issue in that what do we pass by parameter? We've only allowed selected student and points to be passed in. But when we were getting the student list last time, when we were validating the password, we used the staff username. Okay, so we actually need to have the username to get the list of student points in this instance. Okay, so we kind of need username to be there. And I'll just mark it in red for now so that we know that there's a bit of a glitch. And then we're looping for the length of student points, which should be the same length of array as student list, because that'll be their names. And then we say if this current student points total matches Bob, then we should add 50 points to the student points total. But we can't say that it matches Bob because we actually need the student list index to match Bob. And if it does, then we can set student points to whatever it was before plus 50. And so actually there's an issue here because we haven't passed that in to our final step either. So we're missing username, so we can't get the points. array, and we're missing student list, so we can't find Bob again. And this is quite a tricky one. There's lots of ways of solving it. Easy one is just to bring in those two values. And so we could add them down here, and we could just say selected student points, but also pass in username and student list. Okay. And as you realize this, you can kind of go back and increase your data flow or change your data flow to suit. And I'll just change the mock, sorry, the structure chart as well. So that's going to have username and student list there as well. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit. Like I said, there's lots of different ways of doing this. The actually easiest way to do it would be to obviously pass in username, you need that, but also you don't need the entirety of student list. You just need to pass in select a student as an ID, so like the number, the index number, as opposed to the name Bob. But I wanted to give you some options there as well. So there's some examples of creating pseudocode based on your data flow and some of the issues that can be resolved. So this is now resolved. And it's something that you will encounter as you work your way through creating the design for your program. Hope this helps.